Welcome to Grey Eminence Media. Let's get into it.
Set to go back to the polls in a matter of months. The Prime Minister has revealed more details about the upcoming Voice to Parliament referendum.
The voice.
The Voice to Parliament.
The first major hurdle to enshrine an Indigenous voice to Parliament has been overcome.
Here's a question that every Australian of voting age will have to answer this year. A proposed law to alter the Constitution to recognise the First Peoples of Australia by establishing an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice.
So this is the fundamentals of the proposed law. I don't think it's too radical at all. Seems fairly reasonable. It's not asking for any special privileges. It's just essentially creating a body which represents their concerns, right? Sounds pretty reasonable.
Do you approve this proposed alteration? It's a big question, but your answer will be as simple as yes or no. It's a question that for many poses...
The question's not that big. The question is actually very small, and the answer is very easy, and there's only one answer.
There's a few more questions, like what is an Indigenous voice? And why is it up to us to decide whether or not it exists?
It's up to the Australian government to decide whether or not it exists, so that the Indigenous people of Australia could actually integrate into mainstream society successfully. If the Australian government doesn't choose or doesn't give a voice to the Indigenous community in Australia, then in terms of the poverty rates, literacy rates, crime, all of these different factors and issues, you're going to see those statistics continuously to be at the very low end. Essentially, in terms of ethnic groups in Australia, they'll continue to maintain the bottom portion of all peoples listed in Australia. So that's why the government probably needs to get involved if the Aboriginal people would like to see some sort of a significant change within their position in Australian society.
All of us will have an equal say. All of us can own an equal share of what I believe will be an inspiring and unifying Australian moment.
While there's a lot of talk about the voice, things aren't necessarily getting any clearer.
Support for an Indigenous voice to Parliament has stalled.
I mean, all people are asking for is to have a say.
We don't need a voice, we need ears.
The confusion comes into it when we're not quite sure what the powers will be.
And the power that's given to the voice.
All right, yeah, the powers. We'll go into it later, but it's the powers that are given to this to the voice is clearly stated. It's nothing radical, but we'll get into that later.
Is to make representations.
And the Prime Minister has gone down a path where he sees political opportunity and an attempt to wedge, and I don't think that's in our country's best interests.
This is a once-in-a-generation chance.
So before you vote, it's a good idea to know what's at stake. Here's everything you need to know about the voice. Let's start with the basics. The plan is to put the voice in the Constitution, the document that outlines how Australia is governed. To do anything to the Constitution, there has to be a national vote, the referendum. As a country, we don't change the Constitution often. In fact, we've only tried 44 times in our history, on everything from the railway disputes to local government to the length of parliamentary terms.
If they change the Constitution, they're stuck with that for a long time. It's entrenched there and it's very hard to remove. And that makes people very wary of voting for change.
2023 will be the first time in nearly 30 years that we've had a referendum.
You know, they're making it seem like this referendum, the voice, they're making it seem the establishment, or I guess the depending on the political aisle that you're in, they're making it seem like this referendum is giving powers and special privileges to the Aborigines. That would the constitutional lawyer and some of the people that share her opinion on this, quote unquote big change. That would make sense if this referendum actually gave the indigenous people of Australia a lot more power than white Australians. But it's not even close to a situation like that. So, the media and everybody else trying to hype this up as such a big, tough question when it's really not. Right.
Your vote will decide whether there should be a group of Indigenous Australians who advise the government on the issues that affect them and their communities.
You see that? Advise the government on issues. Advise, not proclamate, not dictate, not order. Advise the government on issues that affect them, the Indigenous people of Australia, and their communities. Simple.
But why do people want a voice in the first place? Since Federation, most governments have struggled to make decisions that improve the lives of Indigenous people. Take the White Australia policy or the Stolen Generations. They were actually policies that made the lives of Indigenous people much harder. Combine that with the issues caused by colonisation, and a lot of Indigenous people are worse off than the broader population in terms of health, wealth, and education. Closing that gap has been the aim of a lot of different governments, but nothing has made a huge difference so far. And as of last year, the gap is mostly getting wider. Of all the areas being measured, just a few are on track. Some are actually going backwards. And Indigenous people are still living much shorter lives. That's where the voice comes in getting Indigenous people to have a say over what happens to them, sometimes called self-determination, is seen as one of the best ways to close the gap.
And we know from the evidence that what improves people's lives is when they get a say. And that's what this is.
That's it. Just getting a say. That's the bottom line.
About.
Ideas for something like a voice have been around for a long time, but this version took shape a few years ago. Let me take you back to 2017, to the Uluru National Constitutional Convention. Indigenous leaders from across the country gathered in the Red Centre to try and come up with a plan to improve the lives of their communities.
There has to be some really fundamental change in the relationship. Australia has to hear us, for goodness sake.
After days of talks, a consensus was reached on the Uluru Statement, 400-ish words that outline what Indigenous people say needs to change. The statement asks for three things: voice, treaty, and truth.
It's very short on detail, but it is a very big idea.
6 years on, plenty of research and consultation has been done with communities, organisations and governments, and many believe the voice is the best compromise to deliver change for Indigenous people. This is where...
Okay, so before we continue, let's just go ahead and look at this proposal that's kind of in the face of every Australian. Okay, so here we go. This is the 2023 Australian Indigenous Voice referendum. So the current proposal for the amendment to be inserted into the Constitution is in recognition of Aboriginal, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing this correctly, Torres Strait Islander people as the first peoples of Australia. There shall be a body to be called the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice. Number 2, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice may make representations to the Parliament, right? May make representations, not orders, to the Parliament and the executive government of the Commonwealth on matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. So that's what the news host was talking about, right? Make representations, and then the last part, and the executive government of the Commonwealth. So I don't know why that would concern many Australians or some Australians. They're just trying to make a representation of what they're concerned with, and to voice that concern to the Australian government. Number 3, the Parliament shall, subject to this Constitution, have power to make laws with respect to matters relating to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice, including its composition, functions, powers, and procedures. Okay. So that's kind of the gist of it. And if you go ahead and look at how this referendum is polling, you might assume that it's a no-brainer that most people will support it. But as you can see, as of September 24th, polls show Australia Indigenous referendum support slipping, and it is likely to fail. Okay. So I want to be very clear to the Australian people and to just most inhabitants of the Western world. The last thing you want to do, and I guess we can talk specifically about this since we're looking at the referendum today. You don't want to radicalize young Aboriginal men and women. You don't want to have different violent organizations sprouting up in Australia due to frustrations of that have been built upon hundreds of years, decades of frustration, anger, contempt. So this is actually not going to help the majority in Australia. This is going to hurt the majority in Australia. I mean, what do you honestly think the reaction is going to be? Now, of course, some Aboriginal people think that this amendment doesn't go far enough, and so that they are actually against it, or they don't want to vote for it, or they might abstain from the vote. What I would tell the Aboriginal people in Australia that don't want to vote for this because it doesn't go far enough, you'll be a fool not to vote for it, because it's better to have at least one arm than no arms. Right. So I understand you want two arms, and you should, and it is well within your right, honestly, considering the history of what happened. But you need to be able to take that one arm and continue making progress instead of just giving up like a little victim and then not voting at all to make any sort of change. Okay. But I will say that this is only going to create more problems for the Australian government. And like I said, the last thing you want is some sort of like a Black Panther type of organization sprouting up in Australia, or any kind of like radical, violent extremist groups. Because we've definitely seen plenty of radicalized youth in the US and in the UK going overseas and committing heinous crimes. So I hope that the Australian government and more so the Australian people keep that in mind.
It landed. The Voice would be a group of Indigenous people who advise governments on whether proposed policies and laws would be good or bad for their communities. And here comes the important bit. These are the 3 sentences that could be added to the Constitution in order to create a voice. In recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first peoples of Australia, there shall be a body to be called the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice. The Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice may make representations to Parliament and the Executive Government of the Commonwealth on matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples.
Okay.
The Parliament shall, subject to this Constitution, have power to make laws with respect to matters relating to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice, including its composition, functions, powers, and procedures. It seems straightforward, and is what the Uluru Statement was calling for, but nothing's that easy, and this is where the debate begins. There are 2 phrases amongst all that's raised questions about the proposal, and that's make representations and executive government of the Commonwealth. For some who are arguing the no case, that gives the Voice too much freedom to get involved with a whole wide range of issues.
Too much freedom to get involved into a whole wide range of issues. Do you know how brain dead and disgusting that kind of an opinion is, or that viewpoint is? Dude, these people live in the country in Australia. They live in Australia and deal with Australian issues every day. So they should be involved in issues that are happening in Australia. I mean, what?
If the referendum succeeds, the voice will be enshrined in the Constitution, basically
Mhm.
meaning it can't be disbanded or gotten rid of down the track, something that
Okay.
has happened to First Nations bodies in the past.
It won't be officially abolished until July, but the Aboriginal and Torres Strait
Oh, that's why they don't want to approve it, because it'll be extremely difficult to get rid of an amendment in the Constitution. That's probably the real reason why. But I mean, even if that is the real reason, it's not like this amendment is gonna somehow, enslave all of the white Australians, and the Aboriginals are gonna be taking over the country. I mean, look at South Africa, right? I mean, you literally okay. Can you imagine if there was a black population, let's say in Spain, right? Let's say there's like a very small numerical minority of black Africans in Spain, that they don't rule the country anymore, but they are vastly much more well off than the rest of the white inhabitants in Spain that live in slums and don't have so much economic power, right? Well, that's happening in real life in South Africa, where you have a white minority dominating the economic landscape of South Africa. So this is these political analysts, or whoever you want to deem them as, they're acting like if they pass this amendment, they're gonna have a South Africa situation where like Aboriginals are gonna be taking over. I mean, just like the host said, apparently it gives too much freedom for them, or this amendment will give the Aboriginals too much freedom for input into issues, as if there's going to be some type of a South Africa situation. It's a little bit odd.
Islander Commission is already being stripped of its $70 million worth of assets.
What has happened in most cases, a party will appeal to the voters that it will get rid of this XYZ body because it's clear that it's not working. And that's happened, I think we reckoned 7 times in our history.
The nuts and bolts of the voice would be laid out in legislation that would have to pass the parliament. That means over time, all those details could be changed, but the voice would still exist in some form. There are plenty of questions about who and how many people would be on the voice, how they would get elected, what their responsibilities would be, and some people want answers on that before they vote on whether a voice should exist. There are ideas about a lot of those things already. Most of them come from this report. Professors Tom Calmer and Marcia Langton wrote it in 2021 after speaking with thousands of people and organisations across the country. So let's talk details. Their model for the voice is twofold. First, there would be local and regional voice groups that would be designed and run by communities in whatever way suits them best. The idea is to move away from organisations acting on behalf of communities and empower them.
Like I understand there definitely needs to be a level of curiosity of the internal workings of this body, right? I understand that, but there seems to be this like unhealthy level of deep curiosity of exactly what are the exact mechanism, like who's going to be elected and all these kinds of things. I mean, at the end of the day, whether the Australians kind of like disagree maybe with some of the internal mechanisms of this body, at the end of the day, if the Aboriginal people are satisfied with how their voice or the body works, then we should just leave it at that. If they're satisfied with how their procedures and mechanisms work internally, and if they're able to represent their voice clearly on certain issues, and they're able to convey those messages to the government, then whose place is it really to tell people how to uh, operate their own inner workings of a political body?
To speak for themselves. Those local and regional groups would feed into a national voice. 24 different people covering 35 regions. 5 of them would represent the remote communities, and 3 would be from the Torres Strait. The local and regional voice groups would decide who gets to be on a national voice. Then the different voice groups would work with each other and all different levels of government, from the federal parliament to the local councils. The expectation is the voice would be consulted early on in policy making when it affects Indigenous people, and the voice would road test ideas and make suggestions on how they could be improved. The voice wouldn't have the power to stop policies and laws from going ahead, and any advice it gave could theoretically be ignored. This isn't necessarily the model the government would eventually put into law, but given how much consultation went into the report, it'll at least be a starting point for whatever ends up being put to the Parliament. So why won't the government tell us exactly what the voice will be before we vote? The thing is, with the detail on the voice, even if the referendum succeeds, the Parliament will still write the laws on it. That legislation will still go through the Parliament. So things like how many people are on it and how much public funding it gets could be debated and changed, like any bill. Secondly, a general rule of thumb for getting a referendum over the line is keeping it simple. Section 128 says the Constitution can only be changed when a double majority is reached at a national vote. That means a majority of all voters, as well as a majority of the states, have to vote yes. So to get it over the line, the referendum would need the support of over 8.5 million of the 17 million enrolled voters, and 4 out of the 6 states. Votes in the territories would go towards the national total. Of 44 referendums held to try and change the Constitution since 1901, only 8 have been successful, and the last successful vote was back in 1977. And that's why the government is resisting giving too much detail. It doesn't want the debate about what the voice could be to drown out whether we should have one. And that's what happened to the Republic.
The Australian people have had their say and they have said no.
Experts pretty much agree one of the reasons the Republic proposal didn't pass was the debate stopped being about whether or not Australia should be a republic and turned into a debate about what kind of republic it should be.
It's a sort of area where you need to keep all supporters together and not break off into factions, because
I don't think it's about that. I think it's about, let's just be honest, it's about race. Point blank, period. It's not about, they talked about the details too much and voters got sidetracked and that's why it didn't pass. Those are just all excuses. So what do you guys think? I think the Australians should be ashamed of themselves. I mean, but like the polling indicates, looks like it's not gonna pass at all. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below.